Thank you very much again for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming this afternoon. I will, in the next 10 or so minutes, summarise what I said this morning, but also offer some more general remarks, which I hope we can then, as a group, discuss. So my presentation this morning revolved around ideas of public space, and in that idea, what I was trying to show was how stability can also be looked at in terms of how space itself is marshalled to stabilise time. And in particular, I was interested in looking at aspects of how two different countries have tried to do that for a very specific public space, a public square. Very briefly, I introduced the work as part of a larger project which I'm working on with two others. This project is, I suppose, coming from two sets of literature. One set that is looking at public space as an important element of democracy, freedom, liberalisation, but at the same time how in the West we have a lot more talk now about how that space is threatened by privatisation, by encroachment, by the blurring of the public and the private. And at the same time, the literature that looks at the important differentiation between space and place, and how particular spaces can or cannot create a sense of space. So I very briefly then outline some of the theoretical works that I've been using, but also landing on this notion of assembling, assemblage as an idea that when we take a place or a space, we are actually looking at it not in isolation, but we're looking at it as comprising of component parts. So, for example, if we're looking at a public square, we're looking at it in terms of not just the square, but also the buildings, the trees, the parks, the pavements, sidewalks, pavements, goods, people, signs, all the makeup of the particular sites in question. And it's this assemblage of spaces that is fascinating, I think, because unlike a tree or a bank or any financial institution that is born with an organic, predetermined message and function, the spaces out there are quite different. Those are spaces that are assembled by people, experienced by people, and may end up having quite different effects than those intended by the makers. So I was quite interested in looking at how we can look at these places as stable or unstable in the context of legitimacy and in the context of political change. Very briefly then, there were two countries that is the focus, Kazakhstan and the Kyrgyz Republic. And what is observable is that in these two case studies we have quite different outcomes in terms of how public squares have evolved. So in both of them we took three types of public square and we compared them. The first is the oppositional public square, the one that is increasingly associated with that's where we'll meet to protest type of square. First striking obvious point about Astana is the absence of such large spaces or squares of opposition, and the reference is made most frequently by those in Astana that happens in Almaty, where again many different types of squares and parks are cited as points of oppositional activity. But then the observation that even if that's the case, what we have often are different forms of protest being used that are in marshalling public space, but not in a public square setting. So very recently, the idea of blockading a street, even if that might have been something that was in part manipulated, the idea nevertheless is that that gets someone's attention as much as a protest on a public square. Or the more informal method often used now either by individuals or groups of actually addressing a member of the elite in Astana for help. And I used a couple of examples for that. Continuing with Astana, the second type of public square that we're looking at is that big representative square. And we know some excellent work has been done on the image that Astana has been portraying to the outside world, the image of a tabula rasa, a narrative of a new nation, and the idea that, for example, a large complex in the center of the new area of Astana can give a sense that this is the future that the Kazakh people want to have for themselves. And that complex is immense. It spans 25,000 square meters. It comprises a presidential park, a monument, a peace and agreement palace, a palace of independence, a national museum of Kazakhstan, incidentally the most recent and largest in Central Asia, and as we know also very recently as well, a mosque. That is in many ways the central square. And it's the central one because it's the only one in Astana where military parades are held. At the same time, if you look at the 2030 plan, general plan for Astana, you note that there are in fact 7 centres of Astana. 7 centres linked to the 7 districts of Astana. So the message being given by both the general plan and also by elites is that while we might hold our parades in that central square, and it's the square of independence, it's where we have the celebrations, particularly of Independence Days or birthdays of officials, one in particular. Nevertheless, even if we have that, we are very keen for this to be a polycentric city. Polycentric because we want people to feel part of the city in different areas. So again, there's an interesting issue going on here as to how you then create spaces that have equal weight for different parts of the city, but at the same time obviously try, when presenting the city, to focus on one particular at a particular moment in time. And then the third type of square we were interested in is looking at what, for want of a better term for the moment, we're calling an everyday square, building on work on everyday nationalism and everyday experiences. And this is a park that's in an interesting place, situation in the city. It's the Arai Park, which is on the border between the administrative centre and the Shubari district. And why this is interesting is that it's a park where we've seen all sorts of different goings on with the notion of public space. So first of all, in this park you have a private restaurant, but that at the same time seems to have particular possibilities of access to members of the elite, but it's in a publicly owned space. Secondly, you have, as it were, sites of experimentation, artistic experimentation, by sculptors who, in their usual job, are constructing ideological monuments for the rest of the city, but they use the park to experiment more artistically with some of their work. You also have the park as a favourite strolling place and playground for families. So a lot of different things going on in this park, and again, looking, I think, we wanted to look at how that sort of space makes for a different type of narrative and message of the city of Astana, which can, I think, often be simply the message of presenting what power wants, as it were, as its image. Contrasting, very, I think, interestingly with the Kyrgyz Republic, where we start with the central square, Alator. As you know, this central square has been the site of 2 marches, 2 revolutions in the centre of the city, and it's the new square. It's known as the new square, and it's been used therefore as a site where the marches end and the president's overthrown because it's situated right outside the White House. At the same time, there have been attempts by the government, however, to change that space into an entertainment space. So there's free Wi-Fi. Young people gather, meet there, it's well lit at night, and it therefore has this dual functionality. And already quickly, what strikes one is a difference here of the central place having already within it mixed functions and mixed messages in a way that the central square does not in the Astana context. 100 metres away, we have the old Central Square, where now Lenin stands, having been moved 100 metres from the new square. And in that square, we often see religious celebrations. Sometimes they trickle over to the new square, but generally they're held in the old. So again, we have the juxtapositions very closely in an assemblage type of way of the religious and the secular, of the anti-opposition and the opposition. And again, this I think is interesting. And we have Lenin, Manas, almost head-to-head in this space. Juxtaposed to that is what is, I suppose, an official, has become at least, an official reference point for oppositional meetings, which is Square Gorkova, which is about 600 metres to the right of the government and government seat. And here, I think interesting is the observation that it's actually a rather uncomfortable and unwieldy place for protesters to be. There's not much space to move around, and if you're filming protesters in that space, you can usually only get very limited parts of the group. So that serves, of course, the government, but it doesn't serve the protesters too well. But nevertheless, what we have is recognised areas where people are protesting and meeting in the capital, which is, of course, another difference. Last but not least, we have the Park Južního Valovta, which is interesting for some of the mixed scenarios. And here, more than spatial tensions, we have temporal tensions, where we have newly erected monuments which are in commemoration to Soviet history. We have plans for the erection of monuments that celebrate Kyrgyz history. We have a park that is used for recreation. We also have a whole series of interesting artworks that initially pop up and then disappear. So this temporal, as it were, temporary encasement of certain pieces of work that then are given over to other functions. So that was really briefly, I used some pictures to illustrate, to show, and the research is still really at the beginning stages, but some preliminary conclusions. The first is that perhaps what this is suggesting in some ways is that overt expressions of power in space tend to be commensurate, sometimes at least, with the vulnerability of that power. And I think that that is something one could discuss with relation to Astana. The second, I think, is that while we have observed in the case of the Kyrgyz Republic a tendency to mix different messages in the same area and space, in the Kazakh case we have much clearer examples of what in spatial analysis is called segmentation. And that in turn leads us to ask questions of dichotomies, I think, about authority, authoritarianism and legitimacy generally. Namely, what sort of differences are we seeing between the ideas of authentic and fake? Many of these spaces speak to narratives, the need to write the city, the need to, as it were, create a narrative for the new nations. But what is authenticity? What is fake? Which of these public squares is more fake or authentic than the other in terms of this overall plan? Secondly, I think this something that Luca was mentioning, the importance of the transnational and the international, and its bearing on the particular and the local. And that can make, I think, the contingent universal, but at the same time it can make the universal highly contingent. And lastly, perhaps, the two case studies of countries are interesting, I think, for the differences between a large and a small project. The idea of the dominant landscape of Astana with its wide open spaces and tall buildings to the much more modest project of relocating within existing spaces that we encounter in the Kyrgyz Republic. What does that juxtaposition of dominance and subversion tell us again about authority and authoritarianism? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. And now I would like to give the floor